The longer I've been back home, I've had this greater sense of like, God has like used Detroit and Metro Detroit and ministries in a significant way. And so he's just one example. It's pretty amazing. And I think about and I sort of dream about like, well, Lord, this is what you've done in the past. What are you doing today?
Yeah.
And I think he is doing things today. And so anyway, I love history, but I like it to think about the history as it informs our imagination about, well, what's happening in our lifetime now? Why are we here now? What has God called us to now? And what's he doing now, looking forward into the future?
Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth, but the salt has lost its taste. How shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." It's Matthew 5:3-16. This is the word of our Lord. Welcome to the premiere episode of Light in the D. Light in the D exists to shine a light on biblical gospel-centered ministries that are uplifting the saints and building up the body of Christ and his kingdom in our community and around the world. I'm John Irvine, and sitting next to me, I'm very honored to have Adam Barron. Adam is our first guest. No pressure. You're going to be setting the tone. But for those of you who don't know Adam is Director of Community Engagement and Strategy and Special Assistant to the President at Rochester University in Rochester, Michigan, and the founding director of the Tatlow Society, which exists to strategically advance the mission expansion work of local, national, and international Inter-Collegiate Campus Ministries. So, Adam, wow. Thank you for being on the first episode.
It's really
like I said,
exciting.
No pressure.
No, it's exciting. It's exciting to be here. I'm excited for what you're doing with this Light in the D. I think it could have real mileage because I know that the Lord is doing special things around Metro Detroit in churches and parachurch ministries and nonprofits. And so it's great to be a part of this and to talk about, what God's doing in my life and the places of influence that I have and where I'm working and what I'm doing, and just to see kind of where it's going to go for you in the future.
Awesome. Well, thank you. It's a blessing, and there's so much to talk about, so much to unpack. I mean, you and I have had some pretty lengthy conversations on the phone, and being here in person, and we're going to talk about the Tatlow Society. But for those who are listening again and don't know much about you and your background, how did you arrive where you are today?
Yeah. Well, I'm a Detroit native, born in Hutzel Hospital in downtown Detroit, almost 50 years ago. I'm coming close to 50 in February of 2021. And thanks. And was born there, raised in Rochester Hills, Michigan, then called Avon Township, and went through elementary school, junior high, high school in Rochester, and then as an 18-year-old, went off to East Lansing as a pimple-faced freshman to go to university, start university.
Yeah.
My faith background, I would say, in the words of a Catholic friend of mine, Father John Ricardo, who's someone you ought to consider interviewing. Okay. He said of a lot of folks that he's worked with, they're often catechized but not converted. Mm. And I would say, well, that's spot on with me. I was 18, catechized, not really converted, had enough religious knowledge to just kind of be uncomfortable, but nothing that was real transformational. And on a cold day in East Lansing in November, again, almost 30 years ago now, I prayed a prayer: God, if you exist, if Christianity is true, I surrender my life to you, take over. and the hounds of heaven had been on my heels for some time. And that was a prayer that I prayed, and it really did start a journey for me going forward. Shortly after that, I ended up leaving Michigan State, left East Lansing, and my father, who worked for General Motors, was transferred to Chicagoland, and I ended up landing at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois, which, for those who may not know about Wheaton, I didn't know much about Wheaton until I arrived there, really. It's the center of a lot of evangelical identity and piety and critical thinking about faith and learning, and it was absolutely transformational in my life. My studies really became like an act of piety. I really said, I was sincere as an 18-year-old. If this is true, then I want to understand it as much as I can understand it. If we can have a relationship with God and know the God of the universe, like, what else should we be spending our time thinking about in some regard? Mm-hmm. And so I was a Bible theology major, and I did a bachelor's and a master's degree from Wheaton in theology and biblical studies. And around this time, as an 18-year-old, having born in Detroit, grew up in Rochester, right around that moment in East Lansing, there was a quote by an author that I really at that time wasn't real familiar with, but I now know him really well, and most people do know about C.S. Lewis. Yep. He said, and I'll read it. He said, "Christianity, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The only thing it cannot be is moderately important." And that just really haunted me.
Yeah, and you're not the only one. I've read stories like that. That quote has changed a lot of people's lives.
Yeah. So it kind of haunted me, and kind of just was catalytic in sort of stirring the embers. And what was provided for me in my operational things that were there, those embers were there and they were warm. This quote by Lewis was like gasoline poured on those embers.
Yeah.
And that's, in a lot of ways, that's been kind of since that time as an 18-year-old, I think God sort of branded something on my life. And I like to say I never really graduated from the university, because subsequently I worked at 4 different colleges and universities and 3 different collegiate parachurch ministries over the years since that time. I've lived in Texas, Oregon, California, 3 tours of duty in the UK, worked at a Bible school in Northern England, and worked at a large Anglican church in central London, and then worked for Pepperdine University as their visiting faculty family in Shanghai, China, where I taught New Testament survey and the history of Christianity in China, its roots and relevance in China today. So those 30 years have been just chock full of working at universities, parachurch ministries. It's definitely the calling of my life is the university world and that ecosystem. And it's been a great privilege to do that, and a real honor. And it started, just over 30 years ago now, on a cold day in East Lansing, Michigan, along the banks of the Red Cedar River. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. That's awesome. So when I said there's so much for us to unpack here in talking about your experience and what's going on in collegiate ministry today. And we talked about, we're going to basically split this off into 3 different episodes because there is so much to unpack. But the first, what we want to talk about today is the state of affairs in higher education. And then we're also going to talk about the history of Christ-centered outreach, evangelism, and student engagement by the church. And then we'll talk about the Tatlow Society. That'll be our 3rd episode. But kicking off with the state of affairs in higher education today, and coming at it from a Christian worldview, biblical worldview. I was recently reading this, and I think a lot of parents and students who are going into college were hearing the trends I think this was just recently I read that 75% of students leave their faith behind during college. This was from Scientific American in 2017. They said the number of college students with no religious affiliation has tripled in the last 30 years, from 10% in 1986 to 31% in 2016. And that's according to data from the SERP Freshman Survey. And over the same period, the number who attended religious services dropped from 85% to 69%. These trends provide a snapshot of the current generation of young adults. They also provide a preview of rapid secularization in the U.S. over the next 30 years. Again, lots to unpack there. From your experience and your perspective, what's going on with the state of affairs today?
Well, I like to use the analogy of an airline flight across the country, on a passenger bus, 36,000 feet up in the air. And the university is like that. If you get in your mind, you imagine this airliner, 30,000 feet up in the air, 36,000 feet up in the air. There is a lot going on there. There is the plane itself, i.e. the university, the brick and mortar of it. There is the pilots, the stewards, those in first class, those in comfort seats, and those in coach. There's the luggage underneath the plane taking you to your final destination. And it would be an understatement to say that in higher ed today, there is turbulence. There is it's more than just trying to pass some thunderclouds across the Great Plains or hitting some turbulence in some air pockets when you're going over the Rocky Mountains. I mean, the turbulence is significant.
And it's increasing, right?
Yeah, I'd say it's increasing. It's significant, and it's increasing because it's symptomatic in some ways of what's happening in our, like, the wider culture. But there's a great word that historians use when referring to institutions, be that universities, schools, churches, hospitals, government, and the word is mediating institutions. These mediating institutions produce something. They serve as a conduit for ideas and feelings and cultural kind of cues and disposition towards sort of a particular kind of quote-unquote worldview. So there's all of that at play at the university today in the beginning of the 21st century. But in some more practical, real terms, if you, again, thinking about the airliner, flying across the sky, it is a business. I mean, higher education is a business. So I think within higher ed, and I, if I can speak kind of in a universal sense,
Sure.
There's a lot of people who might have different opinions and ideas around this, but in the broadest sense, like, people are questioning the business model, the cost of education, the cost of maintaining college campuses, the cost of staff and faculty when so much education is going online. And it seems to be, when the world is online, you can learn so much online. So there is almost this existential question of, like, is the business model that we've lived with for millennia, is it maybe all wrong? And how do we think, one, about financially how we can keep this business going? How do you keep the airline running? And then beyond, which is a big thing, but beyond the financial, there are some much more critical questions, almost philosophical questions of, like, but what is the university and what is it for? So is it just a utilitarian thing? Is it just about a transaction? Like, I go there, I get this degree, which then allows me to get a particular job so I can have a particular kind of life and lifestyle. There's those kind of larger questions that I think even inside the institution, in-house, the pilots and the stewards and those in the cabin are kind of saying, what's our final destination? Like, what do we exist for? And then there are the things which maybe we could dive into a little bit deeper. There are these, questions about other, what I like to call like other gospels or ideologies or other orthodoxies that I think a lot of people in the church look at and are frankly kind of scared about. And fair enough. Like, I mean,
Right.
it's pretty sobering, some of the things that we see, kind of ideologies or worldviews coming out of these mediating institutions called higher education, colleges and universities. Now, having said all of that, I would add, though, that, you know, just like traveling across the country can be beautiful and wonderful and exciting, like universities and colleges are also beautiful things, you know, and the best of them, you know, they kind of equip and they kind of become this incubator by which students are able to pursue what is beautiful, what is good, what is true. And so in the best sense, you know, that also is on offer. You know, you think about an institution of higher education in the U.S. or around the world, and you think like, these are places where there's art and music and amazing research and big ideas and worthy dreams that get incubated in these places. And so I would say that the best flights across the country can be these flights at some of these institutions that encourage that pursuit of what is beautiful, what is good, what is true. And that it's not just merely utilitarian, that it allows students and faculty and staff to ask the big questions about life, and hopefully find answers. And I think that is why forever there's been a place for the gospel. You know, the gospel has something to say into that setting. If Jesus is the light of the world, if he is the logos of God,
Right.
then certainly he has a place at the intellectual table and relational table. That he has a place on the plane as anyone has a place on that plane.
Right.
So, you know, there's like 5,300 roughly plus or minus colleges and universities in America. Of those, there's about 1,000 faith-based schools, whether that's Catholic, Lutheran, Baptist, Evangelical, Protestant, of one stripe or another. And, you know, we could talk a long time about like higher education and American higher education and the formation of these institutions, but just in terms of just sort of getting a snapshot, you know, we're on this flight, we're 36,000 feet up in the sky. There are some turbulence, there are some things at play, whether it be financial or ideological, is pretty significant.
Yeah.
And
I was thinking when it comes to ideologies, and I think one thing that seems to have, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, what seems to have accelerated in the concern for Christians is that there are voices that are being silenced or being attempted to be silenced when someone goes to a college campus, and you hear things about, you know, safe spaces and things like that. And we really need to talk about this, but is that a real concern when for a Christian going into a secular college, for example, something that they might be up against?
yeah, there's a quote here that it's from a book written in 1991. A guy named Douglas Copeland, who was a Canadian. He is a Canadian, and he wrote this book, Generation X: Tales for an Accelerated Culture. And it was written 20 years ago in March 2021. I would say this definition is, in the world we live in today, is still true, but probably a little bit more radicalized and almost militarized in its adherence and the tenets of the adherence to it. The quote is this, talking about sort of defining what he called meism. He says, it is a search by an individual in the absence of training in traditional religious tenets to formulate a personally tailored religion by himself, most frequently a mishmash of reincarnation, personal dialogue with a nebulous defined God figure, naturalism, and karmic eye-for-eye attitudes. That's how he defines meism. And I think that, the world in which we live, this is one of maybe a handful, not beyond a handful, but powerful cocktails of what I like to call just other gospels or orthodoxies, by which the adherents ascribe almost a religious piety to them. And so it's when you think of the university, you think this is a mediating institution. It's the place where ideas incubate and start to grow and develop life, and then ultimately, there's a German philosophical word, the Zeitgeist, the spirit of the age. It kind of it impregnates and grows and gives birth to a certain ideology. There are those ideologies, and there are those things, a whole host of isms that you could attend to and be conscious. A student going up to university ought to certainly be mindful of, be aware that they are there, whether you are going to a quote-unquote secular school or even at faith-based schools. These things affect all kinds of campuses in all kinds of different ways. So it's definitely something to be mindful of.
Well, I think it's even in ourselves. I was thinking of this. We have this autonomous want, right? And we want to be our own gods. It goes right back to the garden, right? That's where it started. So, I do. Yeah, you hear. I don't know. The things that I read, I hear there's a lot of concern. Again, going back to the why are so many kids going to college and walking away from their faith? Maybe they didn't have it in the first place.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that I've loved about working with college students, I look back on the impact as an 18-year-old, kind of encountering the gospel in a real way and how it impacted my life. And that has always captured my imagination and captured my heart and my mind. And so in that, I've looked at the colleges and the universities as places where it's like a mission field. It's a place for Christians to be present. And they are. They're everywhere. We get all kinds of places. And they're at some of the leading universities around the world. You will find a Christian witness. I think as far as students matriculating up to university, probably not unlike me, I had been catechized, but not really converted. I didn't know what that really meant. I went through the tenets of my faith, and you can come from a liturgical background, Catholic or Lutheran or Orthodox, but you can also grow up in a Bible-believing, evangelical church, and there are certain tenets and habits and rhythms of life, like going through junior high youth group, going through high school youth group, heading off to Spring Hill Camp, 3 summers in a row, and which are all wonderful things. But I think that Christianity, and one of the things we talked about on the phone the other day is, I think Christianity is more caught than it's taught. Yeah. You got to be in close proximity to the real thing, like a virus. Yeah. You have to catch it, and like it says in the book of Romans, if you catch it, it will both kill you. Yeah. You will die in Christ, but be resurrected in baptism and new life in Christ. So, close proximity is important, and that certainly happens at home, hopefully, but it's caught at home. It's caught with peer groups. My mom always used to say to my brothers and I growing up, "You show me your friends, I'll tell you who you are." And there's some truth to that, right? So there are things to explore, and we could talk about later on about, well, what can a young person do? Where should they go? What should they look for? What should parents look for as they think about and walk alongside their, budding adults? College kids, traditionally 18 to 22, they're post-adolescent. They're not under mom and dad's wing anymore, but they're also like pre-adulthood. Mm-hmm. They're not married with a mortgage and responsibilities the same way mom and dad is. So there's this post-adolescence, but pre-adulthood, and it's a very special time. Yeah. It's a very unique developmental time, and there are things that parents and or students can do to pursue Christ in that context.
Well, I definitely I agree with you. It is something to be caught, and that's my mm-hmm. own story. Mm-hmm. 8 years ago, when I was 42 years of age, I was mm-hmm. born again, and I heard the gospel. I heard the gospel in church, and God used that day, that moment in January of 2012 to open my eyes. It was the weirdest thing, because I don't think it's not like I hadn't heard it before, but maybe the scales were over my eyes. And that day He chose to, drop those scales from my eyes, and it was like an aha moment. So I believe there's definitely something to be said about being around in that community, people who are living out the gospel, preaching it faithfully, biblically, and that's, God uses that to bring people to Him and draw them to Him.
There's another quote by C.S. Lewis that I absolutely love, which is really, when you think about a Christian worldview and conversion and walking a lifetime with Christ, C.S. Lewis says this, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else.
Yeah.
And I think that's one thing that a student going to a secular campus needs to think about. Are the people who are teaching me, do they see, if they have a faith, do they see it like the sun?
Right. And
by it see everything else? See their discipline, whether that's the Bible or biology, do they see it through the lens of their relationship with God? And hopefully, if they go to a faith-based school, then the mission and identity of those institutions are driven by that kind of perspective. And sometimes it comes to us early in life, and sometimes it comes to us later in life. But when it does come to you, you have to decide, is this just moderately important or paramount? And if it's only moderately important, you can kind of just go out business as usual. But if it's of paramount importance, with eternal consequences,
yes,
then you got to take a moment to evaluate. What does it mean for me personally? What's the point of this?
No, are you familiar with Nabil Qureshi? He passed away years ago, and I know he was part of RZIM. He passed away at 33 years of age, but he was Muslim, converted. Great book. I think the book is called Seeking Allah, Finding God, or Finding Jesus is the name of it.
I know his story. Yeah.
Yeah. And there was a movie I watched called American Gospel, Christ Alone, and it opens up with him, and he's saying that when he was out and about and hanging around with Christian friends, and when he learned the truth about his salvation and that there is an eternal hell and there's an eternal heaven and being with God, he was amazed at how many Christian friends of his never said anything to him. And I'm thinking about what you said, like there's an eternal truth that's happening here in our salvation, and there's a consequence, right? And maybe we talk about that a little bit, kind of in the future about sharing the gospel, because there is a sense of urgency to it, and it is important, right? And it's a sense of sharing it out of love. So wrapping up this episode, just real quick, I want to kind of talk about encouragement you would have for parents. We talked a little bit about that just a few minutes ago, but just what would you say to parents who are sending their kids off to college and they're strong in their faith? The parents are, they believe their children are as well, but they're maybe worried about are my kids going to be one of these stats? What can I do to to equip them and give them what they need to stand firm?
Well, one of the things that they could do is happy to reach out to me and talk to me one-on-one. I've talked to different parents whose children are moving towards college and university. I've given them just a handful of resources, books to read, things to think about as they evaluate making a college decision. From really practical things like, do you want to be in the suburbs or the city? Do you want to be in the country? Do you want to be able to, your son or daughter, to be able to drive home? Like, these are just very practical things that I think well, you know what? I never thought about that.
Yeah.
Like I'd love to be able to drive home for Thanksgiving, and I just didn't.
It's like having a good real estate agent.
Yes.
Do you want to live here?
Yes.
Let's all map it all out for you.
All of those
Your school,
things.
drive to work, all these things. Yeah.
And then I think probably for parents who come from a strong faith tradition, whatever their background is, to think about, okay, what will it mean for my son or daughter to go to a large secular research university, what's called a Tier 1 research university, University of Michigan, for example.
Sure.
What does it mean for them to go there? They've spent 18 years trying their best to cultivate faith, prayers at night, Bible reading, camp in the summertime, youth group. They've spent maybe even a faith-based school, Oakland Christian, Bloomfield Christian, Parkway, Southfield Christian. I hope I'm not leaving anybody out. All the Catholic parochial schools in this area, right? They've spent so much sincere effort in developing and nurturing that faith in their children. I would say, well, why now are you going to say, well, go off to the secular campus and good luck, and I hope you find your way. So I would say, you got to really think critically. Like, if I've invested in my son or daughter's life up until this point, why would I stop doing that?
Right.
And if I am, what's my reason for that? Why am I saying, yeah, go to U of M or go to Michigan State or whatever, one of the directional schools, sure. Northern, Central, Eastern, Western, not to say that those are bad places, but when you do to make that decision, then you got to think also, okay, how will this place, what will supplement my son or daughter's spiritual formation? Because it's not going to come in the classroom.
Right.
So what else is going to happen? And who is there to take a hold of my son or daughter, bring them into a fellowship, bring them around other young people to continue to nurture and cultivate their faith? And then obviously you got to think just about what's the mission of the school? What is the prevailing orthodoxies and gospels or ideologies that are driving the institution? I mean, I would look at who are the board members at the university or college, who is the president, the administration, kind of what is their worldview? What are they saying in print? What does the brochure say that you get from the admissions office? And what seems to be reality on the ground? If you can, and when you do, go make campus tours. Try to talk to students. The student tour guide, who is a current student, showing you around campus. Try to engage with them and get a feeling from them what it's like to be at that school. Those are some really kind of practical things that I would encourage parents to think about doing. And do not think that faith-based schools are somehow less robust or less of an education. There are, like I said, over 5,000 colleges and universities across the United States. 1,000 or so of those schools are faith-based schools. Okay. And some of them, none of them are equal. I mean, you even have to drill down on some of these different faith-based schools and get a sense of what, just like I said about the other ones, what are the things it is saying about itself and what are students saying about their experience there. But you really ought to weigh, the realities of, well, what would it be like to go to a larger secular place versus a smaller faith-based school? Or are there some large, students want different things for different reasons. All of a sudden, that maybe they went to a small Christian high school and they're like, no, I want to go to a big university now.
Yeah.
And or vice versa. I was at a big public high school and I'd love to be at a small liberal arts college. And so you just have to kind of weigh the practical and also the philosophical and try to get a really sober, honest picture of what you are, handing your precious son or daughter over to. And but I could say more, and I do have real practical, handout here, take take this into account.
Well, since you opened up the invitation, how can people find you? What's the best way?
Best way to find me would be my email is adam@thetatlow.org, or there's a website, abide.community/thetatlow.org/.
Okay.
That would probably be straight away the easiest way to get a hold of me.
We'll post the link in this.
I should finish also by just saying, I came back to Michigan after being away for 25 years, and I was hired as the dean of students at Rochester University. So I've worn a lot of different hats in colleges and universities. Probably the one I've loved the most was when I was serving as the dean of students, and it was sort of it was just a wonderful role to be in. And so I've lived in the student world and know students and universities and that ecosystem really well, and I love talking about it because I do think in the best form, it is these places where you can pursue beauty, truth, goodness, where your best ideas and your worthy dreams can be hatched into reality. And like I said, these are places where there's art and music and athletics and creativity and dynamism that is wonderful. It's wonderful. America has the best educational system, higher ed system, I would argue, in the world. Friends of mine overseas would probably say that's not true. But I mean, it's a fantastic educational system, higher ed across the country, of all kinds of different stripes and sizes and shapes and colors, and it's really dynamic. And most of the world has always wanted to come to America for education. Yeah. So these are great places. There are some things to be conscientious of, to be aware of as you enter into that ecosystem, or board that plane to make that flight. There's just some things to be conscious of, but it can be a beautiful journey and a beautiful thing. I mean, I've 3 master's degrees. I'm a glutton for this, stuff, right? And I've loved learning and growing and engaging students and faculty and playing sports, and it was a wonderful thing. And to kind of, be loyal to your alma mater and go back for football games, and special thing.
I think I think the big takeaway there is, like, parents don't be too nervous. Just do your homework, do your research, and there's a lot of choices out there, good choices, and definitely reach out to Adam, to seek his help, and I know he'd be glad to help you. So I think what we'll do is we'll end here on this first episode, and then we're going to pick up in the next episode. I'm a history nut. I know you are, and so I'm really, really excited to hear what you talk about the history of Christ-centered outreach. Presumably we'll be talking about America, probably over the last 100 years or so. So thanks again for being on the first episode of Light in the D. So until next time, brothers and sisters, in Christ, keep walking in the light and being the light for others, and we'll see you next time.